we're going to start by talking a little bit about the tensions in photography, because photography was, in fact, both from the beginning, a commercial process and regarded as a fine art. But I'm afraid those people who advocated it as a commercial process were much in the majority. It always had this dual nature. Some of the people really wanted to use it as a fine art opportunity and for purely artistic purposes. But for most artists, it really was a business opportunity, and portraits vastly outnumbered any kind of artwork in the first few years of the medium. The three artists that we're going to talk about this afternoon successfully merged the two ideas, business and art, while also pioneering as women in a male-dominated profession. One that was, however, more open to women than many other professions at the time. And if you haven't noticed already, I speak rather quickly, but I know you want to get to those cookies. So, Julia Margaret Cameron was a wife and mother of 6 children, which was exactly the proper role for a British Victorian woman. She was married to a jurist, a judge, a lawyer, Charles Hay Cameron in 1838. And in 1860, he retired from the law and the family settled into the Isle of Wight. And there, Cameron, after 6 children, was almost an empty nester. And her daughter and son-in-law came to visit, and they were worried that she would be bored on this island away from society in London, no kids to keep her busy. So they gave her this newfangled thing, a camera. And at age 48, she took up photography as a hobby. She converted a chicken coop into a studio and a coal bin into a darkroom. Now, Cameron was part of an elite artistic circle that included literary people, artists, scientific geniuses, and political leaders. And she could turn to them both for advice and as models. Her intention, though, was always from the beginning to use photography to make art. Quote, "I longed to arrest all beauty that came before me. And at length, the longing has been satisfied." She wasn't too modest. "Its difficulty enhanced the value of the pursuit." However, photography was still very much experimental chemistry at the time. She says, "I began with no knowledge of the art." And boy, was that true. "I did not know where to place my dark box," in other words, the camera, "how to focus my sitter," and many people complained that she never did anything in focus. "And my first picture I effaced," in other words, she erased it to her consternation by rubbing my hand over the filmy side of the glass. They were using glass plate negatives. The emulsion was on one side, and she rubbed her hand over it and just rubbed away the picture. The image that's upstairs, one of the three that we're going to talk about, is her portrait of Silene. It actually was Silena Wilson, who was Cameron's adopted daughter. I guess an empty nester didn't work too well for her, so when this young woman, her sister and brother, their parents died in the early 1860s, she adopted the 3 of them. Their father had been a seller of woolen cloth. And so Silena was her adopted daughter. And she, like many other people that Cameron ran into in any way, shape, or form, got drafted to serve as models for her photographs. So family, servants, neighbors, and local tradespeople all got pressed into service, torn away from whatever they were doing and told to pose. Now, she did pay laborers such as farmers and field hands when they posed. They got half a crown an hour, but family like Silena, they didn't get anything for it. Now, Cameron often did portraits of many of the notable figures of the time, but she often blurred the boundary between the portrait and the posed dramatic scene, as in this image. And she had Silena pose as various figures. It's not just this one image, but you see her as Rachel, who was from the Bible, the wife of Jacob, mother of Joseph and Benjamin, as Rosalba, a young bride torn between duty and desire in the play A Virgin Widow, by the photographer's close friend, Sir Henry Taylor. And here we see her as, we don't know exactly which figure she's representing, but certainly some kind of flowery goddess. Also, you might notice that her hair is down. Now, in Victorian times, that was not the way proper women walked around. So once you were sort of at that cusp between girlhood and womanhood, your hair was supposed to go up if you were going to be in polite society, and only when you married your husband would see you with that sexy idea of your hair being down. So she's clearly a mythological figure of some sort. Now, photography soon became more than just a hobby for Cameron. She took it up in 1863 and had her first museum exhibition in 1865 at the South Kensington Museum, which now is, of course, the Victoria and Albert Museum. And it was one of the only museums that was showing photography. And at this time, really, only a very tiny elite group of practitioners and critics even thought about photography as an art form. Get in that far. We do know that she apprenticed for a brief time with a major commercial photographer of the day, Oscar Rylander, who ran his studio very much as a business, but who was also one of the people who argued for photography as an art form. And George Frederick Watts, a leading British painter and one of her friends, wrote to Cameron, because I guess she was sending him photographs, "Please do not send me valuable mounted copies. Send me any defective, unmounted impressions. I shall be able to judge just as well, and shall be just as much charmed with success, and shall not feel that I am taking money from you." Now, while she and her husband weren't like among the super wealthy, they certainly weren't poor or even middle class. So why this impetus to sell her photographs to make money, we don't really know. Cameron was one of the earliest photographers to show her works in an art gallery, one that handled old master paintings and sculptures. Her photographs that were sold through the gallery bore the blind stamp that you see here on the mount, letting you know that they had been purchased at the establishment of Messieurs Colnaghi. Now note, this is a blind stamp specific to photographs. They weren't putting this on their graphic prints. Colnaghi claims to be the first commercial gallery in the world, founded in 1760. And amazingly, it still exists today. This is their webpage. Cameron also not just sold them and blind stamped them, but copyrighted her photographs. Very unusual process at the time, registering them with the Copyright Office. And you see one of those copyright registrations here. And remember that that was noted on the Colnaghi blind stamp that her photographs are registered. Don't try to copy them. Not that anybody could just copy a photograph anyway. This price list from one of her shows survives with notations about raising prices, I guess the ones that sold well, prices for other works that weren't on the list. And it has two interesting statements. It states, "Mrs. Cameron's photographs are all taken from the life direct and are not enlarged." And each person ordering is requested to mention whether the gray or the brown toning is preferred. So you could choose your toning. Now, the most expensive prices on the list are 20 shillings, the cheapest 3 shillings. 20 shillings is about, a pound in those days was $185.94 in 2024 dollars, US dollars. The average wage for a 10-hour day, a 6-day work week for a common laborer was 3 shillings 9 pence. So he would have 9 pence left over if he wanted to buy the cheapest Cameron after working for an entire week. The weekly wage for a London artisan was 36 shillings. A shilling was 20 shillings was a pound. Cameron's cheapest photographs equaled almost a week of work, her most expensive ones, for half a day for an artisan, or half a week rather, for an artisan. And despite some criticism of her work, and she did get criticized, especially for focus and scratches and things, her work was very well regarded. In fact, she was one of the 4 leading lights of British photography, and she sold really well. Now, in 1875, Cameron and her husband returned to a coffee plantation that they owned in Ceylon. And with them, they took a cow, her photograph equipment, and 2 coffins in case you couldn't get a coffin in Ceylon. She died, and here's one of her photographs from Ceylon. She continued to photograph there, although these photographs don't have nearly the circulation and the desirability of her more metaphorical, dramatic ones. She died there in 1879. You're looking at her grave, somewhat neglected, at the age of 64, and was buried in one of those coffins. And her husband, who was 20 years older than she was, used the second coffin the following year, joining her in this grave. Our second woman of the day, Gertrude Käsebier, was like Cameron, a wife and a mother. And she also just happened to become one of the preeminent American photographers at the turn of the 20th century. She ran an extremely successful portrait studio, and was a highly revered member of the Pictorialist movement, a fine art movement in photography, and considered a peer with Clarence H. White, Edward Steichen, and Alfred Stieglitz, some of the leading lights whose names are still pretty famous. She was at the top of the field in photography, both as an art form and as a business. And few, if any, male or female photographers were able to replicate this level of success. How many of you have heard her before the show? Yeah, not a lasting fame, alas. Her husband, she was born in Fort Dodge, Iowa, so she was a pioneer baby in 1852, and she grew up in Golden, Colorado, when it was a rough and tumble mining town. She grew up in a log home. But at age 12, her family moved to Brooklyn in 1864. Quite a shift. She married at age 22 to a 28-year-old German emigre who was in the shellac business. Now, his business allowed the family and her to enjoy an upper middle class lifestyle, but it was not a happy marriage. She could never please him with her cooking and housekeeping skills, and she was, of course, at the time also raising 3 children. Now, in the late 1880s, when her children became adolescents, Käsebier decided to take up photography so she could take family photos. And you see her here is not one that she took, but you see her here with her children and her husband. Well, in 1889, at age 37, she all of a sudden felt compelled to become an artist. And she enrolled at Pratt Institute to study painting and drawing. And she was even able to spend a year studying art in Europe. She was primarily making fine art photos. And gradually, she moved away from an interest in painting and drawing to an interest in photography. And part of that was speared by the fact that in 1894, she won a $50 prize from a magazine contest for the best figure in a Greek costume. That's about 1,800 in today's dollars. And she was a runner-up in another publication's photo contest for women. Now, in 1896, her husband was suddenly given a diagnosis that he would live for 1 more year by his physician. He did outlive that diagnosis, but nonetheless, all of a sudden, Käsebier had to begin thinking about income. She was going to have to support the family. And so she decided to open a commercial portrait studio. So first, she spent months interning in several photo studios to learn the tricks of the trade and set up a darkroom in her home. And in late 1897 or early 1898, she opened her first New York studio. And here we see 2 of the portraits, because the way to make money certainly was not through making art photographs, it was through taking portraits. And these are 2 of her more standard kind of portraits. Coming from art school, though, she didn't take the kind of standard commercial portraits. She was able to reinvigorate the tried and true formulae with new ideas, and she became extremely successful, even though the portrait business was very much male-dominated. She didn't bother with the kind of painted backdrops, the fancy settings that many other commercial studios used, shifting from those Victorian values to those of the contemporary arts and crafts movement, which admired simplicity and craftsmanship. Most often, she made platinum prints, which are more typical of fine art photographs than commercial photos at the time. But these were artistic portraits, and therefore, of course, she could also charge more. She said that she sought to make, quote, not maps of faces, but pictures of real men and women as they know themselves, to make likenesses that are biographies. On your left, you see a portrait of Honoré Wilsey Morrow, who was a successful author of fiction and nonfiction and a magazine editor. Like Käsebier, a commercial woman with success. She was a divorcee, which was unusual and bold behavior for the era. And then she married a publisher, William Morrow. And Käsebier's portrait, while appropriately demure, nonetheless conveys the sitter's intelligence, energy, and directness, enlivening a formulaic composition, it's a bust, a headshot, through pose, framing, and highlighting. And on the right, you see Oberlin's own Adalia Antoinette Thiel Johnson, who was an Oberlin grad and the first female professor at Oberlin. She taught history and went on to become dean and professor of medieval history. And Käsebier shows her looking at works of art. They may be reproductions of other things or possibly Käsebier's own photos, because the photo probably would have been taken in Käsebier's New York studio. Now, Käsebier charged about $10 for a sitting and 2 prints, which is about $375 in today's market. Extra prints cost $5 each. So how many of you would spend $375 to have your portrait made by her? Nobody? Oh, I would. I would have for sure. In the early years of the 20th century, her average gross annual income was around $4,000 to $6,000, which would be up between $143,000 and $215,000 in 2024 dollars. So she was doing very, very well. We have no way of estimating what her expenses were, but of course, remember there was no income tax in those days. So she was making a very nice living. Now, New York commercial portraitists in those days closed their studios in the summer and followed their wealthy clients to Newport, Rhode Island. And Käsebier did this too. There she made portraits. Don't forget, she needed to make money. She needed income. But she also created artistic works, including in 1899, this work called The Manger. Now remember, she began by studying painting and thought of herself as an artist. So portrait photography was really more of a day job that she just had to do a lot of. Motherhood was one of the major themes in her artistic work and her portrait work. Now, photographing women and children was one of the entry points for photography for women in those days. Women were considered to be innately more aesthetic than men, and thus more suited to beautiful subjects like women and children. As women, supposedly they understood the bond between mother and child, and so often were hired to photograph women and children. And as women, it was considered safe to let women and children pose with them without having to have a male escort present. Now, to create The Manger, Käsebier posed her friend, who was an artist, Frances Delahanty, in a whitewashed stable in Newport to create a nativity scene. Now, in this much admired scene, which is an exemplar of the mother and child pictures, there's actually no child, just swaddling claws bunched to look like one. So a very successful fiction. And the white robe may in fact have been borrowed from the costume trunk that always accompanied fellow photographer F. Holland Day, who was quite a dramatic character, often liked to dress up even just going around the streets. And apparently he carried in his trunk an angel's white robe, which got turned into a virgin's white robe. Now, the Oberlin print, you might notice, if you saw the show upstairs, is a photogravure, which is an ink on paper mechanical printing process. And the print is made from a metal printing plate. Because of that, the image is reversed from the photographic print, which you see on the right, a copy from the Buffalo AKG Museum, that was made by Käsebier herself. Photogravures were the principal way at the time to disseminate really high quality reproductions of photographs and other works of art. And the printing for this photogravure, my guess is it was probably done for inclusion in Camera Work, an important magazine about photography that we'll talk more about in a minute. Its printing was probably in fact supervised by that photo superstar, Alfred Stieglitz, who was the most important figure in American photography at the turn of the 20th century. He was not just an eminent photographer, but also an impresario and an important arbiter of taste, and a skilled master of the photogravure, whose family actually bought him a printing plant so he could exercise control over it. The photogravure and platinum print are very similar in mood and share the primary traits of the movement known as pictorialism, prevalent at the time in the most elevated of fine art photography circles. So they both share a soft focus. Remember, Cameron was criticized for soft focus. It became the style of the day in pictorialism. There are delicately modulated tones, and it's a stage or posed scene that belied the factual nature of photography. Photography was often not considered a fine art because it was too tied to reality. And therefore, unlike painting or drawing or printmaking, you could only photograph what was in front of the camera. You had to be truthful, and you couldn't use your imagination as an artist. Well, the pictorialists thumbed this right up, no way. And they created these dramatic stage scenes, including things like The Manger. Now, it took a lot of work to get that look, that pictorialist look. It wasn't achieved by just snapping the shutter. In fact, the straight sort of print from the negative, which you see on the extreme right, is very, very different. And work would have been done on the negative and sometimes on the print to turn the photograph from a document into a work of art. Now, there wasn't a huge market for fine art photographs at the turn of the 20th century. And some people like Stieglitz and his fellow pictorialists argued in periodicals and in shows about the validity of it as an art form equal to painting and sculpture. They argued that photography was not necessarily tied to reality, but could be expressive. However, that didn't help its financial value. But in 1899, word got out that a print of the manger had sold for $100. That was an astounding price for a photograph in those days. Now, that would have been for a platinum print. And it was more than Alfred Stieglitz, the Dean of American Photography, had gotten for one of his prints. Now, $100 in 1899 would be $3,783 today, which is a pretty good deal. The highest auction price for Käsebier at this point is $59,700, but in private sales, works by her have sold for over $150,000. It sounds very impressive until you think about the fact that, wow, the prints now, the highest prices achieved by the male photographers like Steichen and Stieglitz are well into the millions. Now, who bought it? A millionaire? No, another woman professional, the famed actress Ellen Terry, whom you see here photographed at age 16 by Julia Margaret Cameron. Now, Käsebier was really one of the most highly admired practitioners among those who believed that photography was a fine art. And when that Alfred Stieglitz, remember him, decided to publish a journal, remember camera work, that would promote photography as a fine art, Gertrude Käsebier was the artist that he chose to feature in the first issue, a woman. And 6 full-page photogravures of her work were included, identified by Stieglitz as her best and most artful images. And of course, one of those was the manger. So Käsebier managed to have it all: a family, even if not such a happy married life, commercial success, and recognition as one of the leading photographic artists of the time. Our final photographic figure today is Margaret Bourke-White, who after graduating from Cornell moved to Cleveland in 1927 with her mother and brother. Now, although she had taken and sold photographs on the Cornell campus, she really learned to photograph in Cleveland, thanks to guidance from local photographers and from a camera store owner. She'd go in and go, what do I do? And he took her under his wing and taught her. Now, she wanted to make a living from photography, but not from taking portraits of women and children. That was not her thing. She longed to get inside Cleveland's steel mills and photograph the drama of industrial manufacturing, to make scenes like this one, which she did later on. But none of the companies would let her, a woman, inside. And in fact, one of the company owners that she appealed to said, the last time we let a woman inside the factory, she fainted. And she said, I'm not a fainting type. So how did she get access? Well, women were considered appropriate to photograph aesthetic subjects like gardens. And at that point, there were all these magnates had just built these very fashionable country homes, which had very elaborate gardens. And so Bourke-White appealed to their wives to let her photograph their gardens and got commissions from home and garden magazines. And then she worked on the women to work on their husbands to let her into the steel mills. And she finally succeeded. In 1928, she got permission from Elroy Coulis, and some of you may have been in Coulis Hall and various places named after Coulis in Cleveland, to photograph the mills at the Otis Steel Company in the Flats. It's now, well, it's actually now where the Innerbelt and Dead Man's Curve are in Cleveland. The mills occupied vast swaths of property, and in addition to photographing inside, Bourke-White photographed the other features that you could see from the outside, such as the photograph that's upstairs in the show, that showed how the factories dominated the landscape, and they showed industry towering over the individual. Now, if we compare these other two views of smokestacks at Otis Steel, we see that Bourke-White was trying not just to find a great angle, but also a way to express the scale, the power, the geometry, and the dominance of these structures. And in fact, they were very much adored by the factory owners and also by things like banks that had magazines, and so she got publication in them. However, she wasn't exactly the person who pioneered this vocabulary. In 1922, on a trip to visit his sister, you see Edward Weston, his view when he stopped to photograph the Armco steel plant in Middleton, Ohio. And he made one of the early modernist photographs, one that emphasized the composition, the geometry, and the abstraction of the smokestack's forms, all the while still keeping that pictorialist value of soft focus and in fact using palladium, which is similar to platinum, to make his print. And the year before, Charles Sheeler had been commissioned to photograph the Ford Motor Plant in Detroit, the River Rouge as it's known, and had taken geometry and abstraction of the industrial structures even further. And his view was even more fully modernist. It was printed in sharp focus as a gelatin silver print. Now note that Bourke-White's view still had that pictorialist soft focus in these years, even though she was making gelatin silver prints, she was emulating a lot of those pictorialist values. She was able to sell her photographs to various publications as well as to the mill executives, and they drew the attention of a New York magazine publisher named Henry Luce, who in 1929 hired her to work on this new magazine that was aimed at the businessman, a real deluxe publication called Fortune that he brought out just at the heels of the Depression about American business and industry. He was great at timing. And she officially became a photojournalist. Now, even though she was making a good salary from Luce publications, she also took on outside work such as advertising. And how did she sort of present herself? Well, she presented herself always as a very prosperous businesswoman, even when she had no money and very few commissions. So here we see her office in Cleveland. Where was it? The Terminal Tower. She had the newest, tallest, hottest building. When she moved to New York to work with Luce, she had to be in the Chrysler building. And you see her climbing out on one of the gargoyles of this new building that was just being built. And that was her office, which was designed by a high fashion modernist designer. And she eventually became, when he started Life magazine, she got the first cover. So she was the one who had her image on the cover of the first issue of Life magazine, which maybe at the time didn't seem quite as wonderful a thing, a nice thing, but now, of course, it's a very historic moment in photography and in journalism. And it became sort of the bastion of photojournalism. Now, even when she had the contracts from Luce and from the magazines, Bourke-White still had to find a way to supplement her income, especially during the years during the Depression. And so you see her here doing food photography, tabletop food photography, painting the food with some kind of thing to make the color more accessible, or going into a sausage factory. So it wasn't just all elevated things. She was a businesswoman and she had to take jobs when she could get them. However, when World War II came, she really became the first accredited female war correspondent working in combat zones and the first to fly along on bombing missions. And she really established herself at the head of her field, both women and men. She was the only foreign photographer in Moscow during Germany's bombardment in July 1941, and she witnessed the US troops liberating the Buchenwald survivors in April 1945. And about that, she said, "I had a deep conviction that an atrocity like this demanded to be recorded. If man can do it, then man must be strong enough to look at it. You can't pretend it didn't happen." Life continued to give her plum assignments after the war, and she traveled around the world, filling its pages with important images of history in the making, such as this famous image of the Mahatma Gandhi's spinning cloth. These three women found a way to earn a living from their photography and to combine art and commercial success. Cameron and Käsebier fulfilled the societal expectations of their time by being wives and mothers, but they also created their own fulfilling and financially successful careers as artists. Bourke-White married briefly, but never had children. Her career took precedence. I think it's wonderful that she photographed herself in pants. And she ended up going all over the world for her career. Each of them in their own way was a feminist pioneer, but they were still exceptions at the time. Photography remained a field dominated by men. Happily, that is no longer the case today. Thank you.